Hello, and welcome to Your Gardening Week. This is where you can find answers to your specific questions so that your week ahead in the garden can be quite successful. I'm Gardener Scott, and I discuss everything gardening so that you can become a better gardener. Today on Your Gardening Week, I'll answer questions from last week, get to some questions from this week, answer everything that I have time for, maybe share a little bit of wisdom along the way with the intent that you'll become a better gardener and we'll get some of those important questions answered. Let's go ahead and start with a quick response to a number of questions that I had last week. There were quite a few questions about potatoes after I started answering some questions about potatoes. So let's get to that right now. Emily V asked, she said, I can't find seed potatoes. Can I try farm-bought organic potatoes? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. Potatoes, seed potatoes in particular, are sown to start your potato plant. But like many other things you can get at the store, or especially organic from a farm, just get a potato, and as long as it's got some eyes, you should be able to grow your own potatoes. As long as it's not a hybrid. If it's a hybrid type of potato, the actual plant may be different, but you can expect that the tubers should give you the same results as what you plant. And then Heidi Clark asked, how about planting potatoes in 7-gallon pots? Sure. 5-gallon buckets, 7-gallon pots, 10-gallon fabric containers, all of those can work very well with potatoes. The key is deciding how many plants you put in. So if you have a 5-gallon bucket, you might only want to put 1 or 2 of the seed pieces. But if you've got a larger container, you might be able to grow 2 or 3 with absolutely no problem. Vic T asks, can potato plants produce seeds? And can they cross-pollinate? And absolutely. That's how some of the professional growers develop new types of potatoes. Because like most plants, a potato will send up its flower stalk. The flowers will produce seeds, and you can plant those seeds to get a new potato plant. It's a little more time consuming, but you can definitely take 2 different types of potato, cross-pollinate, and maybe even create your own type of hybrid. So you might want to experiment with it. As far as within a particular season, you should be harvesting your potatoes before they send up the flower stalks. And Derek Cox asked, how can I know if a potato is determinate or indeterminate? Is planting them very difficult? So this is actually a great question because many people don't realize that potatoes are in the same family as tomatoes. And just as there are determinate and indeterminate tomatoes, there are also determinate and indeterminate potatoes. But it's really difficult to determine by looking at the plant. So you would need to know the variety, and maybe a plant tag will tell you, or maybe the grower will tell you. And from that perspective, you have to do a little bit of research. But there are different types. As far as planting, they're no different. Just like tomato plants, you plant them the exact same way, you harvest the same way, but there's a difference in potatoes. So I thought that was a great question. So hello to everybody. We've got Gail from France. We've got lots of people checking in. Money Pit Homestead from Kentucky. Steve Workman from West Virginia. Good to see everybody here today. I'm glad to do this again. It's been a month now. This is the 5th of the live streams. I'm starting to get a little more comfortable. Hopefully you're getting a little more comfortable. I'm trying to establish a format that works best for all of us. And so I welcome your inputs. As I move forward, if something really resonates with you and you like it, please put it in the comments. Or if I try something new and maybe you don't like it as much, put that in the comments as well. As we stream, I can't see all of the comments as they zoom by, but I always do a review and get back to what you said in the previous week. So I see some coming up already. Johnny Castile asks, what is your preferred method for growing mini cantaloupe if you are low on space, along a fence or trellis? You basically answered your own question. I prefer a trellis that is set up with sun from all directions. Unless you have a south-facing fence, you're probably not going to get adequate amounts of light on a plant like that. So a trellis right in the middle of your garden, maybe on the north side of a bed, that's how I like to grow my melons, my squash, my gourds, my cucumbers. It's called vertical gardening. And instead of letting the plants just spill out across the ground, you grow them straight up. So great question. Let's see. Sam Radowick says, what do you feel about waste right in the garden? No time and labor to build compost bins, all the labor moving compost. I don't do a lot of that, partly because I don't have a lot of waste. And so the question is, you'll see this, and I'll have some future videos about this, where you take your kitchen scraps and you'll bury them into the soil in a bed. And then the worms will find it, a lot of those other microorganisms and small soil animals, and they'll work through the decomposition and then move it throughout the soil. I think it's a great idea. For me, most of my kitchen waste actually goes to feed my worms. The waste I have in my garden isn't necessarily suitable for burying. It works best for kitchen scraps. So if you have a lot of kitchen scraps and you don't have worms, it might be a viable option to bury it in the soil, especially if that's really your only source of waste and you don't have enough for a compost pile. So give it a try. I wouldn't do it right next to plants, and I would probably try to avoid growing plants directly over the buried waste right away, because you might have some nitrogen deprivation problems. But sure, give it a shot. Excuse me. Lots of great questions coming in. Let me get back to some of last week's questions, because there's some really good ones that I want to cover. And it's always good to see a lot of the returning people. Heidi Clark, good to see you again. Mrs. Marvel, good to see you again. Money Pit, Homestead, lots of returning people, but I see some new faces as well. So if this is your first time here, or if you're new to the Gardener Scott channel, in the comments, just click or just type in new and tell me where you're from, because we're getting people from all over the world, which I think is just absolutely fantastic. Oh, I love the questions. So I'll try to get to as many of these questions as I can today. And then what I can't get to, I'll definitely get to next week. So looking back to some of the questions I wasn't able to get to last week, Freedom Flyer asked, is pressure treated wood bad for garden boxes? I don't think it's bad. In fact, I use a lot of pressure treated wood. And I know this runs counter to how many gardeners practice. And if you don't want to use pressure treated wood, no one's forcing you to do it. But depending on where you live and how you garden, it might have some benefits. In the old days, and we're talking, approaching 20 years ago, I think, pressure treated wood was treated with arsenic. And there were definitely some problems with that type of pressure treated wood. That has been outlawed now. And almost all of the pressure treated wood is treated with a copper-based solution, because copper has some great properties that can prevent some insect damage, and it also reduces the rot, because the bacteria can't break down the wood and the fungus can't break down the wood. So I'll use pressure treated wood on the lower half of my raised beds typically. If you're in an area that might have a termite problem, pressure treated wood might be a solution, because the chemicals that are used in that processing are probably going to deter some of your termites. As far as the concern about it leaching into the soil, I've seen some tests that show it leaches into the soil, but only within a millimeter or two. And for the most part, most of us aren't planting that close to the wood. So for the benefits, the wood doesn't rot, it can deter some harmful pests, and it really doesn't leach into the soil and cause damage to the plants. I think it's definitely a viable option. So we've got Lauren Lee from Rhode Island and Shakira from Atlanta, Georgia. E. Boone from the Old Netherlands. Daddy Carl, aloha to you too. We've got Tron back from Vietnam. This is great. So you can see, and I like to stress this, and I actually made a video about it. Gardening is a universal language, and it doesn't matter where you are, where you're gardening, you're part of this big family of gardeners. So as I am talking and giving the answers and giving you some information, do participate in the comments, because I have no doubt you'll be able to learn from some of the experienced people we have in Canada, some of the people that we have following from other parts of the world. And just because you might be in a cold area right now, or a hot area right now, a lot of our problems are the same, and a lot of the questions we ask are the same questions that others are asked, which is one that Diane D asked last week. I just mulch up leaves and till it into the garden in fall. Is this method useful? Absolutely. That's one of my preferred ways of adding organic matter to the soil. Now, I don't always till in the leaves because I tend to practice a no-till gardening method, but I'll also mulch up the leaves and grass, and I'll put them on top of the beds. And then I'll allow that as a mulch to sit over the winter. It helps protect the soil so it doesn't degrade in the sun, it doesn't wash away, it reduces weed seeds that might blow in, but it also gives opportunity for all that material to break down and enrich the soil. Tilling it in the fall is preferred to tilling it in the spring, because that allows some months for it to break down. Definitely consider doing that if you're not, whether it's leaves or grass or peat or compost or aged manure. In the fall, you should be adding organic matter to your soil. Okay, Jay Dixon is asking, can you cover your beets at night to help save heat? Absolutely. In fact, my video that's coming out on Wednesday shows how to do that. I use a lot of plastic with hoops. One of the other methods I've talked about before is to take like a gallon milk jug, a plastic jug, and just cut off the bottom and use that to cover a plant at night. If you got a really cold stretch that's going to hit, like overnight it's going to get very cold, a single sheet of plastic might not be enough. So what you can do, and what I've done before, is to take a tarp, like a really thick cloth or plastic tarp, and use that to cover the plants. Beets can actually handle some pretty cold conditions. 28 degrees Fahrenheit easily, even 25 degrees probably for a low. So as long as the temperature is above that, you might not need to worry about covering. But if you got a really quick cold snap, absolutely. Cover it during the night, but then uncover them during the day so they don't get too hot. Okay, going back to last week, Roxanne said, I just had some beds, 4x8 beds built. They are set with the length north to south. The south side is a bit lower. Is this okay? That's exactly how I set up the majority of my beds. I like to orient the long side of my bed north to south. And the reason for this isn't so much during the height of summer, but it's for the spring and the fall plants that I'll be growing in those beds. And so envision the sun going across the sky, rising in the east, setting in the west. And in the summer, it's almost directly overhead. So it really doesn't matter how you orient your beds in the summer. But in the spring and the fall, the sun is lower in the sky. So if you're in the northern hemisphere, the sun is going to be lower to the south, and it's opposite in the southern hemisphere. So what that means is you're not getting equal coverage across the whole bed as the sun goes across the sky. If you orient your beds north to south, you get a little more coverage as the sun rises, goes across, and then sets, because you basically have the long side of your bed exposed to as much sun as possible. If you've got the bed oriented east-west, then that southern part of the bed is getting the bulk of the sun, and the north side of the bed is not getting as much. You can choose the height of your plants regardless of how you orient your beds. If you put your taller plants to the north side and your smaller plants to the south side, or as you say, have the south side of the bed slightly lower, that definitely helps. Ultimately, you don't want to be shading the plants. So don't put tall plants in front of the short plants that might be behind it. Keep the sun impact into effect. Okay, let's look at some of the other things. Easton Rogers. Hi, do you have tips for corn? New from Tupelo, Mississippi. What branch did you serve in? Oh, thanks. So if you're looking behind me, you might see that that's a picture of me in my younger days when I was in the Air Force. So I retired from the Air Force back in 2003, and I put in just a little over 20 years. So that's the branch I served in. I appreciate you asking the question. But as far as growing corn, especially if you're new with growing corn, the most important thing to realize is that corn is pollinated by the wind. It's not pollinated by bees or any type of insect. And so when you grow corn, you need to grow it in blocks. You don't need acres of it, but in your garden, you need to have a pretty good block of plants. And the plants can be 6 or 8 inches apart, but you might need to have at least, say, 12 rows of 12 plants, a good block, because as they grow, they're going to need that wind to pollinate, and the pollen actually will fall down onto those little hairs that are on the individual ears. That's what causes the actual kernels to start growing and to plump up. So if you're new to growing corn, plant in a block. Don't plant in a long row because you probably won't get much corn. They also take a lot of nitrogen. So if your soil is low on nitrogen, be sure you're adding some compost and maybe even some nitrogen fertilizers. And then you probably don't have a big problem with rain, I'm guessing. There's a lot of us that have difficulty growing corn in our gardens because it's just so dry in the summer. So if you get a lot of natural rain, it's probably not an issue. But if you live in a dry area, you're definitely going to need to irrigate your corn because it likes nitrogen and it likes water and it definitely likes a lot of sun. Okay, great questions. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, so I'll add them for next week. That's wonderful. Okay, Sam Radowick wanted me to discuss hand tools, and that's a very broad subject. What I'll say is there's a couple hand tools I think you need for your garden. The first one being a hand trowel, just a little small shovel. I use my trowel a lot to dig holes, to plant seeds, to dig up weeds. That is probably the hand tool I use the most. I also use a knife, and I'm using the type that is just a cutter that you would use around the house with an extendable blade, but some type of knife because I'm constantly cutting pieces of twine to trellis up the plants. I'm cutting open bags of compost or some other material. I'm opening seed packages, so a knife is also very important. And those are really the two hand tools that I carry the most. you should have some type of pruner, or as they say in the UK, a secateur, and that gives you the option to prune a plant if you're out in the garden. And so my approach to gardening is I go out, I have a particular task in mind, but while I'm out there, if I see something else that needs to be done, it's best to get it done right then. If I see small weeds growing, it's best to pluck up those small weeds. If I see something that needs to be pruned, it's best to prune it right then because you never know when you're going to get around to it. So those are the things that I often carry with me every single time I go into the garden. A set of pruners, my trowel, and some type of blade. Do try to get good quality because my little extendable knife I've had for over 20 years. It's metal and is still holding strong. As to what other hand tools, think about how you want to garden and get a good quality tool that's going to last you for a long time. I've covered some of this in a video I had around Christmas time where I talked about some of my tools. And I actually have another video that I've got planned, I think in the beginning of June, where I'll be talking about my favorite tools for the garden. But just figure out how you garden and use the tools that are most appropriate. Okay, so the Mrs. Marvel's asking, also, if you keep clean and take care of your trowels and tools, they last a lot longer. Yeah, that's one reason why I'm using 20-year-old tools. I don't leave them outside in the weather. I put them in a place where I always know where they're at. I'm not as good about oiling them before the next season starts, but that's a great idea. If you get good quality and take care of it, your tools will last as long as you do in the garden. Okay, let's move on to Wayne Kerr. He was asking, can I mulch the trees with bark and pine needles? Yes, I use a lot of bark mulch and I use a lot of pine needles as mulch. And I've mentioned this before, pine needles do not acidify your soil. That's a myth. So if you've got access to pine needles and bark, and I'll actually use pine cones that I crush up into smaller pieces. Those are great mulches. Because they come from conifers, they'll have resins in them, which means they take a lot longer to break down. So as a mulch, they are very long lasting. Because they're long lasting, I'll typically use those kind of mulches around trees and in my pathways. In my actual garden beds, specifically vegetable beds, I'll use straw and grass and leaves, the kind of things that can break down and amend the soil pretty quickly. But by all means, if you've got access to those kind of things, use them as mulch around trees. Do leave some space between the trunk of the tree and the mulch. You really don't want to pile it right up next to the trunk. You can have some disease issues, some rotting issues, and there's lots of animals like voles that will burrow underneath the mulch, and they love to start gnawing on your tree if they're protected by the mulch. So leave some space between the tree and the mulch. Okay, so Mr. Gypter says, you seem to be coughing a lot. Are you okay from the COVID-19 virus? Thank you for asking. It's spring. I've got allergies. I've got some post-nasal drip and sinus issues. And so that's why I'm coughing. It's purely allergies. I appreciate your concern. I took a decongestant hoping it might soothe things a little bit, but no, I'm staying at home. I'm in my garden. I'm in a state that has a stay-at-home order, and I'm resisting the urge to go out and get some of the things I would like to get for my garden, but instead I'm staying home and during the day going out and getting things done. This last week I put some seeds in the ground. I moved some more soil to fill some of the beds that I had already built, and I'm staying as healthy as I can, except for the allergies that always seem to pop up at this time of year. I hope you're doing the same. I hope you're well and getting out in the sun and enjoying the garden. That's a great way to stay healthy. So Diane D, I think he's coughing because his throat is dry from talking so much. That's part of it. If I'm not doing all of this talking and it's just me working in the garden, I don't cough much at all. So, and that's another reason why I keep sipping on my tea, to help soothe the throat a little bit. So thank you so much for the concern. Okay, let's move on to some more questions. I had so many great questions from last week. And so what I'm thinking of doing, and let me know your thoughts on this. I try to pick the questions that I know I'll have time for, the ones that I think are suitable for a lot of different gardeners. But I get a lot of questions, either from my videos or from this live chat. If you have a suggestion of how I can post some of those answers, please let me know. And it might be as simple as a video. If you want me to do a video where it's nothing more than reading a question and giving a real quick answer, I can do that. If you want me to post it on my community page on the Gardener Scott channel, I can do that too. But you know me, I like to give a response, not just an answer. I like to explain what the answer is and how it works. So the only way I can get through a whole bunch of questions is to give really short yes and no kind of answers. So if you want me to do that, please let me know in the comments. But if you want me to continue with more thorough discussion, then I'll do that as well. I'm going to give thorough discussion regardless of most of the things that I choose to talk about. But as far as some of those real quick answers that or questions you might have, let me know what kind of answer you're actually looking for. Okay, let's talk about me for a little bit, only because these are some of the questions that I had asking about me. DJ Lane asked, what elevation are you at? And this is a real quick, easy answer. My garden is almost exactly 7,000 feet above sea level, which I'm guessing is probably higher than just about all of you. So if you've got a garden above that 7,000 feet, let me know, and I'll pass the prize over to you. From Stephen Gocking, did you live in the United Kingdom? I often refer to the UK because I love British gardening shows. And I think the UK approaches gardening so much better than the United States approaches gardening. In the UK, gardening is like a sport. They have festivals. They have entire events that are televised nationally every year that have nothing to do with anything but gardening, like the Chelsea Garden Show. There are, Garden Festival, I think is what it's called. There are so many wonderful things about how gardeners in the UK garden that I follow a lot of UK gardening channels. I love watching Monty Don and Gardener's World whenever I can get opportunity to do that. And so I've visited the UK 5 times, but I've never lived there. But because of their approach to gardening, I think I'd like to live there in some respect, even though it's completely different than I am gardening right now. So look at some of those UK channels. Pay attention to how the UK gardeners grow. It's probably very different from how you do it, but they've got some great lessons. Our wood chip garden asked, what soil do you have? And so I did a soil test recently, and I have a sandy loam soil. And really the only way you can determine what kind of soil you have is by doing a soil test. And I'm actually pretty lucky by having sandy loam. I could have clay, and I would prefer to garden in sand than clay. Okay, yes, 5-Minute Gardener Daily and Night says the flower shows in the UK are awesome, but all are closed this year. And that is a terrible repercussion to all of the world events that are going on right now. So many of those things are closed. But that's another reason why we need to get outside and grow our own flowers and get our own vegetable gardens to the point where we're harvesting. Because in the past, it might have been real easy to watch how other people did it and enjoy other people's successes. We don't have that now. So do it yourself and take advantage of your own learning along the way. And there's still a lot of good material out there. Okay, Jennifer Segrist says, I have a lot of compost and a small amount of seed starting soil? Could I put the compost down, then the seed soil on top to start seeds outside? I would go ahead and mix the compost in with whatever soil you have. I'll use compost as a mulch on top of the soil if it's a really rough compost that hasn't fully decomposed yet. But if it's a decomposed compost and it's ready to use, I wouldn't stratify it. I wouldn't use a layer of one thing and then a layer of another thing and then a layer of compost. I would mix it all together, and it's more likely that the soil organisms will benefit when it's all one big mix than it is when you've got levels of different materials. Mia Nani, yes, I found British Gardening on Netflix. Love Monty Don's show and what he does for people. And Monty Don has a series of shows that it's many years old, but he actually toured Italian gardens. And so he has a series of shows where he goes to different Italian gardens. And he's got another series with French gardens. And he's got another series around the world in 80 gardens. And they're just fantastic shows where he's traveling and he's showing you gardens from around the world. And I've gotten so many great ideas watching Monty Don's shows. Some of them are just incredible. And he's actually motivated me at some point when we can get back to traveling and the world recovers to a point where it's close to where we were before. I do have the intent in the future of making some of my own traveling garden kinds of shows where I'll go to different places. I'll start locally and then I'll branch out through the US. But I also hope at some point to get to other countries and tour some of those gardens and then make the videos to show you what I've discovered. So when you can start traveling again and discovering gardens, start with Monty Don's shows and then get out yourself and discover what you can do. And so John-Ann Johnson, Living Happy and Well, says, love his French and Italian gardens. Love him. I'm glad some of the rest of you have discovered because he's just fantastic. 5-Minute Gardener, Daily and Night. Monty Don did a show this year where he went around America showing the diverse gardens in America. He loved how you do things on a much bigger scale. I haven't seen that. I'll have to look for it. That's actually wonderful. He's so good at just making you feel like you're actually wherever he is as well. Okay, getting back to some more questions from last week. Rob OX asked, I have broccoli plants ready to go. Can I put them in the ground? My last frost is April 16th. Yes, absolutely. You asked this question last week. You could have gotten them in the ground last week. Broccoli is not as hardy as a plant like kale, but it can handle some frost. It can handle some good cold conditions. It does better when the soil is warmer, but when it gets too hot, it might bolt and the heads might not taste as good. But you can definitely put it out 2 to 3 weeks before your last frost without any problem whatsoever. Waskapo asks, what is the one plant that you would grow that you have just not been able to do so successfully? A plant that can be grown in your area, but you have never had any luck with. And that's a really good question because there's a lot of those plants. The one that most recently I had issue with was a lemon tree. Now, I can't technically grow lemon trees in my area, but growing it inside or in a heated area, it can be done. And I've killed 2 lemon trees attempting to grow them in my house. And they can be put outside in my area, but I've never been able to get them to the point where they're big enough and strong enough to put outside. So the one plant I would really like to grow would be a lemon plant. My son actually lived in a house back or actually outside New Orleans, Louisiana. And in his yard were all of the fruits that I couldn't even begin to think about growing here, including citrus. So I wish I could grow citrus. I just can't. Thank you for asking that question, because even when you know what you're doing and you do everything right, my area is just too dry, even within the house. And I think that's a huge factor. I'm going to try a third lemon tree and see if maybe I can get it to work this time. But no, I just haven't had any success with that. Ranan Satyahadi, will beets planted from kitchen cuttings produce beet roots? Or will it be like a carrot producing leaves only? So you may have seen this or done it when you were a kid, where you took a carrot and you cut the top off and a plant grew from the top of the carrot. You can do the same thing with beets. You can do the same thing with just about any root crop. The top will grow into a plant, but no, the root will not continue growing to give you the beetroot that you would expect. It will send out some new roots, but those will all grow laterally. You're not going to get that big, deep root, and especially with beets, you're not going to get it to grow into a big bulb. So it's a fun experiment just to see how the plants can grow from a little cutting of the root, but it's not worthwhile as far as being able to harvest. Okay, Liliet Cardosa. I found a supplier of green waste compost. It is very black and screened. Is this good to mix in my garden beds? Probably so. The only question I urge gardeners to ask when they find a source of compost or some type of material that's going to be used in the soil is just to ask the question where it came from. I like to use a lot of grass and leaves to make my compost. I don't have enough from my yard, so I'll gather from my neighbors and family. But if they're using chemicals on their grass or chemicals on their trees, then I'm not going to use those leaves or grass to make my compost. So ask the question. As long as the source is a good source and there won't be any chemicals transferred into your garden, yeah, it's probably a pretty good source of compost. And I get quite a few questions about this on some of my videos. People who live in an area where their city actually produces compost that is free to use. That's a great opportunity. Just realize that if it's one of those operations where anybody can give organic material and then it's turned into compost for you to use, there are many herbicides that can actually survive the compost process. And then you put that compost in your garden and you're putting some of those herbicide chemicals into your soil. And then you wonder why your plants don't grow. And I've heard this from a number of different gardeners where they used some free compost and then ended up killing all their plants. So do ask about the source before you use it. Joanne Johnson asks, can I use new cedar or pine bed bedding as a mulch around veggies? Absolutely. And this plays into the same concept of using pine needles or bark. They'll take a lot longer to break down, to decompose than some of your other options. So especially the new material, it breaks down quite quickly. Now, the bedding that you might use in a chicken coop or in a horse stall, or if you've got goats, I'll use some of those wood shavings and actually put them into my compost pile, because a lot of that wood has now the manure and the urine from the animals, and that source of nitrogen will help them break down a little bit faster. But as far as new clean material, mulch is a great option. It may be a little more expensive to buy that material and use it as opposed to finding leaves or pine needles. But if that's what you've got sourced, use it. Okay, Jennifer Segrist last week said, was thinking of starting some tomatoes and basil in plastic cups and selling them in front of my home late next month. Have you done anything like this before? Absolutely. When I was running the Galileo garden, it was a school garden. We had a 42-foot dome greenhouse, 101 raised beds, about 15,000 square feet of open bed space that was planted with different fruit bushes and fruit trees, and the entire operation had no funding. The only way we can operate was by the funding that I was able to procure. And one of the methods was to have an annual sale of plants. And so, as I've said in earlier broadcasts and previous videos, I've grown thousands of plants. And one of the reasons I can say that is for 4 different seasons, I grew thousands of plants with the intent of selling them to the public so that they could help pay the entire garden operation. Now, within your city or your town, there might be some rules about what you can do in your house and what you can sell in your front yard. But as far as growing plants to sell to others, it can be done very easily. It's best done with plants like tomato and basil if you do it indoors, under lights, in very controlled situations. It's a lot of work. It's the kind of thing where you know you're growing a plant and it's not for you. And so you have to devote the time, the energy, the space. But as long as it's something you want to move into, definitely. And I would also encourage, I mentioned this last week when I was talking a little bit about hoarding seeds. If you've got some plants started, or if you're still in the process of starting some plants, grow some extra. And if you need a little extra income, by all means, sell them. But if you don't need that extra income, well, then consider giving those plants away to a lot of the new gardeners out there. My channel has just exploded in the last couple of weeks. I know a couple of you have noticed that. Today, I should hit 70,000 subscribers. And it was a month ago where I was talking about getting to 50,000. So huge growth. I know a lot of those people are brand new to gardening. They're not sure what to do. And there's probably some people around you that might fall into that category. So if you feel a little more comfortable, if you've got some extra plants and extra seeds, share them with some of the new people that are just starting to get into gardening. I think that's a wonderful way for all of us to connect. You know, we're separated by distance, but we're still connected with our gardening mentality. Kathy Seeger is asking, I have a ton of leaves. What do I mix it with? Veggie scraps? What else? And how long does it take to be ready? So it depends on what you want to use it for. If you want to use it as a mulch, I mix my leaves with straw. I live in a very windy area, and leaves by themselves blow away. But mixed with straw, they tend to stay in one place. If you want to make it into compost, then crush up the leaves. It's going to take a long time. Last week I talked about making leaf mold. It takes a long time for the leaves to break down. If you mix them with a nitrogen material, like kitchen scraps, like urine, like manure, they'll break down quicker. But it's going to take a long time for the leaves to break down to become a usable compost. The big question is what quantity you're using as well. If you have a lot of leaves, mix them with something like manure, leave them in a really big pile, keep it moist, and essentially you're creating just a big compost pile. When you do it that way, the inside of the pile can actually decompose pretty quickly, and you might have usable compost in just a couple months. If you're just dealing with a few leaves, then yeah, I would do it in a much smaller scale, probably in a compost pile mixed with all of the other kitchen scraps and garden waste that I would normally put in a compost pile. Okay, Deb Hawk is asking, does cardboard bring in termites? And from what I've read and was able to research, cardboard is not a big attractor of termites as much as wood chips. might be an attractor of termites. And depending on how you use cardboard, if you're using them at the bottom of your beds or if you're practicing lasagna garden, as long as you keep it moist, earthworms really love cardboard. And I use a lot of cardboard in my worm bins. And so I have cardboard for the animals that like it, like worms. I don't have a big termite problem in my area, so it's not as big a deal. But as long as you've got it covered, it's probably not going to be an issue. And most of the uses for cardboard in the garden, you're going to want to cover it with a mulch or with compost or with a soil. And in that case, it's probably not going to be as big an issue with termites. Gary Zer, I was going to use it to fill part of my fill or raised beds and mulch around veggies. Will that be okay? I think I might have missed the beginning part of that. But as long as we're talking about an organic material, my best performing video, the one that just went over 1 million views, which to me is crazy, is about how to fill raised beds. And I use a lot of different material in my raised beds. That video was showing a hugelkultur method where I used branches at the bottom of a bed. I also use wood chips. I use straw. There's a lot of things that can be used. If it's organic and can break down and it's not contaminated with chemicals, definitely use those type of things. And that actually plays in with a question that Rob asked last week. Can we compost weeds? Absolutely. And I know this runs counter to a lot of information you see about what you can compost. I live in an area with a lot of weeds, and the weeds in many areas are out of control. And when the wind picks up, the weed seeds are blowing everywhere. Everywhere includes my garden. So if I were to go to the trouble of not using weeds in my compost, I would still have weed seeds in my compost. I think it's much better to use some of that material to get the benefits of compost. Now, in saying that, I try not to compost the seed heads. If I'm cutting some weeds or pulling some weeds that have already gone to seed, I will separate out the flower portion, the seed portion. The rest of the weed is perfectly fine to compost. And then I'll take those seeds and I'll throw them in the trash. That's one of the few things that I typically don't compost much because I don't want to intentionally introduce weed seeds into my garden if I can avoid it. But as far as the weed plant, you can definitely compost it. There are some weeds that can re-root if you put them into compost. And so for those type of weeds, if you've got that type where maybe it's a really pernicious type of weed, let it dry out. That should kill it. And then back to the raised bed discussion. I put a lot of weeds at the base of my raised beds when I fill those beds. It adds some good nutrition to the soil as they break down. And when those weeds are covered with 8 to 12 inches of soil minimum, there's no chance that they're going to germinate and sprout and grow. Okay, thank you, Heidi, for all of the information that you're passing back and forth. I know you're a very active member of the live stream and also on the videos as well. So thank you so much for participating. And Jay as well. I know that you play a great role in helping the comments and helping answer the questions. So I appreciate all of your efforts. I appreciate all of your questions as well. Liliet Cardosa, what if the weeds are scraped with a tractor and piled up with topsoil mixed in? Much of my garden is actually constructed that way. In one of my videos that I did last year when I was brand new to this home and creating my new garden, I rented heavy machinery and I scraped off the top surface, which included a lot of weeds, and that was mixed in with the topsoil. I let it sit in mounds over the winter, and now I'm taking those mounds and spreading them out and leveling areas of my garden. So I'm gardening that way. Are there going to be weeds mixed in with that? By all means. It just means I need to be on top of it a little bit more to capture some of those weeds when they're still small and don't allow them to grow and get to the point where they start producing weeds. I'm also going to use some heavy mulches in those areas. That's where I'll be putting a lot of my fruit trees and building a small orchard area. So I don't want those seeds that might be mixed with the topsoil to sprout if I can avoid it. So I'm using a lot of mulch so that they never germinate. And then they'll continue to decompose over time and help improve the soil. Okay, let's get to a point that Denver 1865 raised. So last week, I answered a question about how to keep cats out of the garden. And Denver 1865 raised the point, cats and dogs are beloved in our family spaces, including the gardens, exclamation point. It's a learning curve. Absolutely. So the question was how to keep cats out. And even if you have a family cat in your garden, you still might want to keep the cat out of the bed. If you've watched any of my videos, you've probably seen, I've probably got at least 10, if not 20% of my videos where my yellow lab Lily will either photobomb a shot or she'll actually be part of the video. I think cats and dogs can be very important to gardening because I'm really my only family member that is active in gardening. So what that means is I'm gardening by myself. And like many of you, I don't always like to be by myself. But if I can garden with my dog, I'll actually talk to her and I'll actually seek out her opinion when I want to plant something. Now, I know she's not going to answer, but it really helps me feel like I'm not gardening alone. And I've had 2 other dogs in the past. My best buddy of all was Shaka. She's been gone for almost 10 years now. And she was a regular part of my gardening experience, my gardening journey. And I think all of my dogs, and you'll see this in the videos, where Lily will just walk up and lie down right next to my feet. They like gardening too. They like being outside. They like being with me. So please don't think that when I talk about how to keep pests out of your garden and how to keep animals away from your beds, that in any way I'm talking about your family pets. I'll have a video in the future. I plan to get another dog sometime this summer if I stay on schedule. And so I'll be doing videos on how you can train your animals in your garden so that they're not digging up your plants, they're not walking where they shouldn't walk, and they become a partner in your gardening experience. So I hope you have the opportunity to do that as well. Just by sharing, it's great. Thanks, Heidi, for some of the information about the cats. Yes, I've also seen that the cocoa shells can help keep the cats away, and they're also a problem with the dogs. Chocolate is bad for dogs, and particularly labs, will eat anything. So I've heard about the cocoa shells, but that's not anything I've tried in my garden because I know that they'll eat the chocolate shells. OMFUG, my dog is my best friend. Absolutely. Dogs are easy to become your best friend. Okay, let's move on to a couple other questions we have. I'll go to the very back. I'm trying to cover as many of these as I can. And so this plays in with a couple issues. When I was talking about hardening off, Robert Moore asked, how about shade cloth? And definitely, when you harden off your plants, you just want them to initially put them in an area where they're not exposed to the harsh sun and conditions that will damage the young seedlings until they're strong enough to handle it. That's what hardening off is. And shade cloth is a great way. I've done that before. You know, I like to use hoops in my garden, and I've got shade cloth. And so if I have a lot of plants that I need to harden off, and I used to do this at the Galileo garden, I would take some hoops, cover them with shade cloth, and underneath that shade cloth, you could put dozens and dozens of plants in pots and give them some really good protection. So shade cloth is definitely a consideration. Connie Burns asks from last week, at what point should tomatoes be fertilized? Ours are still small and under lights, not planning to put out until May. And so be careful about fertilizing just to fertilize. Many of the potting soils that you will buy already have fertilizer in them. And young seedlings can be damaged if the fertilizer is too strong too early. Their roots are basically damaged to the point that it's going to damage the entire plant. So if your potting soil has fertilizer in it, you probably don't need to fertilize at all during the entire time that you're growing the seedlings inside. If you make your own potting soil, consider adding fertilizer. And so in my video, when I make potting soil, I add blood meal and I add bone meal and I add green sand to help incorporate some of the fertilizers that most plants, most plants need. In that case, you know that you've added fertilizer and you don't need to add more. But if you're using a potting mix that doesn't have fertilizer, then you will need to add some type of fertilizer. It needs to be a weakened fertilizer. So a balanced fertilizer like a 5-5-5, mix it at half strength, and you want to apply it at that point where the plant is starting to put on some true leaves. The seed gives all the nutrition it needs for those first cotyledon leaves, but once the true leaves start developing, the roots need some nutrition. So I would consider fertilizing early, probably after the second set of true leaves starts developing. I would consider fertilizing again about a week or so before I'm putting them outside, and that's usually enough. You don't want your plants to get too big and too tall before you transplant them, because particularly with tomatoes, I think they transplant better when it's a plant that might only be 12 inches tall. I've tried to transplant tomatoes that are 24 and more inches, and they just don't transplant as well. So do try to keep the plants a little bit on the medium side and consider what kind of fertilizer you have in your soil. Okay, so at this point, PJB, outstanding. Thank you so much for that super chat. I appreciate it. And at this point, thank you for that lead in, because I want to focus back on you all at this point. I'm trying to figure out a good format, and I've called this Your Gardening Week because I really want to provide information that will help you in your gardening week to answer the questions that you have right now, hopefully not more than a week old, so that as you're gardening, you've got time-sensitive information. And I share with you the things that I've done during my gardening week. And so in this last week, my cool season plants, or seeds I should say, are outside. They're under plastic. But go ahead and let me know in the comments right now what you're doing this week. And it doesn't need to be in the form of a question. Or if you had something that you did last week that you thought was a major event, that you learned something, it was something new that you tried, share that with me now, because I'd really like to see what we're all doing. And this gets back to that global mentality of gardening, because I know the people in New Zealand are gardening differently than I'm gardening right now in Colorado. And so share with that. I'll go ahead and respond as I see some of the comments come up. And I encourage you to share some of those comments as well. And so let's focus on each other right now and what we're doing and how this week is going to be great. As I'm looking ahead to this next week, I'm looking at continuing to fill some of my beds and putting more plants in. And hopefully some of my trees and fruit bushes that will arrive in a dormant stage will be arriving soon. So that's what I'm looking forward to. Daniel Brown, harvesting radishes. Excellent. This is a good time of year in the Northern Hemisphere when things are cool to be starting to start your radishes. You might be harvesting within a month. So let me know, Daniel, when did you actually start those radishes? I'm guessing not much more than a month ago. Okay, Man Cave, planting spinach, starting tomatoes indoors. Excellent. I actually started my tomatoes last week, and I'm actually still harvesting some spinach that survived the winter. Awesome. John Ann, going to be planting your watermelon, spaghetti squash, and butternut squash. You're obviously in a much warmer area. I also do all of those seeds at the same time within the same week because they've got the same needs. So good for you. David Gringras in Atlantic, Canada, planting seedlings indoors. So you've still got some extra time ahead. Good for you. Lee Gao asks, how do you plant potatoes in straw towers? Great question. I'm actually going to do a video devoted just to that. I layer them. I'll do straw and compost and straw and compost and straw and compost. And then I put my seed potatoes deep within that mix of straw and compost. So the compost helps give it some nutrition right away. The straw gives it some good moisture retaining material. And then at the end of the season, I just open up the towers, let that good soil now spread out into my garden area and harvest the potatoes. So real quick answer to that question. I've had some really good success with that. Master Yip, your 20th year gardening in Colorado. Good for you. I've lived in Colorado now for 23 years, and I think this might be my 20th, if not 21st year gardening in Colorado. It's been very educational, as I'm sure you can attest to. James Henold, built my first bed this week. I'm going to build a hinged hoop top with chicken wire to prevent the squirrels from attacking my seedlings. Excellent. Good for you. I'm glad to hear that. That actually sounds like an extensive project. Move North Homestead, putting up hardened off plants out in beds, setting up structure, trellis, put in raspberry and blackberry in mineral buckets, self-wicking tubs, zone 6B. That's great for 6B. You're at least probably 2 weeks ahead of me as far as the zones are concerned. But it sounds like you're about 6 weeks away from me as far as the last frost is concerned. Eliarne J started some beets, carrots, fava beans, peas, radishes yesterday as an indicator, and we'll plant lots more as I see signs of life. That's a nice approach. I like that. I've kind of done that, but not with the way you phrased it. I'll plant and then intentionally plant a couple weeks later. But as you're starting to put some things in your garden, especially when it's still cold at night, great idea. Put some seeds in, put some plants in, see how they do. And if they do great, do some more. And the result is you've accomplished succession planting. And when it comes time to harvest, you'll be able to spread your harvests over a good period of time. So that's wonderful. Daniel Brown took my suggestion, starting a garden journal. Good for you. Do I have the exact day I started the radishes? Oh, you do have the exact day, and that was February 19th. Outstanding. So you started your seeds February 19th. took about 6 weeks or so for you to be harvesting your radishes. And that's good to know. And so what I would encourage, you can do it right now and next year as well. And I encourage everyone who's keeping a garden journal. Next year, definitely start radishes on February 19th, but also start radishes maybe 1 week later. Start radishes on, say, February 18th. And then compare how the harvests are. You might find, and this is a way a garden journal really helps out, as soil is warming up, germination rates will quicken. And so with some of the early crops that we start from seed, they'll grow, they'll do well, and like that radish, you harvested in about 6 weeks. But if you wait a week, your soil may be warmer and you'll be harvesting in 5 weeks. And so ultimately, you're still harvesting at the same time, but you can recognize how much faster the seeds will germinate and you'll get to a harvest when you delay by just a week or two. And a garden journal is a great way to actually figure out the best time historically for you to start your seeds each year. So that's awesome. Sam Radowick, are you a beekeeper for pollination? I hear bees are getting endangered. I'm not sure if you're asking that to someone else in the chat or if you're asking for me. I'm not a beekeeper yet. That is part of my long-term plan. Right now, there aren't enough flowers in my area to support the bees that I would want to add. So I'm going to focus on flowers and the plants that the bees need for their own food sources. And when I get all that in place, then I'll be adding the bees. For now, I'm relying on a lot of native bees. I have a video out there about how I built my bee hotel. There's a lot of other insects that can be attracted to the garden with herbs, for instance. Herbs are great at attracting insects that will pollinate other plants. So I'm expanding the garden, and I'll get to bees at another point. Joyce Pendleton is harvesting strawberries and the first zucchinis. That's awesome. I actually took some video that I'll use in some future video. My strawberries just this week have started sprouting after the winter. No strawberries yet, just the leaves. So I'm a little envious that you're already harvesting. Let's see, you learned that you personally only have luck with strawberries in pots with afternoon shade cloth in Arizona. There you go. We all differ how we garden. I can grow strawberries in full sun. They'll overwinter, but that's because of where I live. My brother lives in Arizona, and he shares with me a lot of his gardening experiences, and shade cloth is almost absolutely necessary as you start moving into the summer. So that's great that you've learned some of those lessons. M. Little, kids interplanted radishes and small Parisian carrots in an onion bed. Radishes doing great, carrots starting to germinate, squash seeds that planted are germinating now. Good for you, getting the kids involved in the garden. I've said that before, I'll say it again. I think kids are definitely a necessary part. If you're going to have your animals in your garden, get your kids in your garden. Man cave, awesome. You counted the filled holes in your bee hotel yesterday and you had 26. Awesome. I've just started seeing some bee activity, so I haven't seen anything happening in my bee hotel yet, but I hope I have the success that you do. Great. Hey, Sam, thanks. Saying everybody hit the thumbs up. I appreciate so much. I saw that in the replay last week. I didn't see it when it was happening live with the call out for the thumbs up. It does make a difference. YouTube sees that. And when YouTube sees that, it sends out the notifications to other people that maybe a video is worth watching. I think my videos are worth watching. I think my newer videos are way better than my older videos, but I'm all about giving you the information. And if we can share that with more people, then that's the better. And your thumbs up, your comment is a great way to get the information out to new gardeners. And so I want to move on to a topic as we move a little bit closer to the end. Thank you for all your comments. Blasphemous Buddha, you're growing borage for bees. Yes, I grow a lot of plants like borage, for instance. I don't eat borage. I haven't really learned how to put it into my diet yet, maybe someday, but that is a kind of plant that I grow to benefit the bees. And there's a lot of plants like that I let flower past the point of harvest just to benefit the bees. So good for you. Okay, so the point that I'm saving until this part of the live chat, and this again is part of a format change, or not change, but let's call it a modification that I want to do every week. So if you're benefiting from it, let me know in the comments. If you want me to do it differently or not do it at all, let me know in the comments, and I'll modify in the future. But this is my point where I want to share some of my gardening philosophy. I know I intersperse it in my videos and I intersperse it within my answers, but I want to talk about being a gardener and what it means to be a gardener. And I say that I want to help you become a better gardener. I don't say I want to teach you how to plant a carrot seed, because I think being a gardener is much more than that. And I can tell in comments in many of my videos where I'll make a 10-minute video and I'll show how to do it and I'll explain why to do it and I'll share my experience with doing it. And the comment will say, this could have been a 2-minute video. Just tell me how. Well, that's not what this channel is about. This channel is about you becoming a better gardener. And could I do 200 videos that are 2 minutes long that show you and tell you how to plant a seed? Sure, I could do that. But what I'm hoping you're gaining from my videos and you're gaining from this live chat is the message, the experience, what it means to be a gardener. Being a gardener is more than just putting a seed in the ground. It's understanding what that seed needs to grow and what that plant needs to survive. And then what you need to do to get to a point where you can harvest it. And then how you can use that harvest, either in your kitchen or by preserving it. And I've got videos across my library that cover each of those topics, because that's how you become a better gardener, is you go through the entire journey of gardening with each of those pieces. And once you garden for any amount of time, like those of us that have been gardening for 20 years here in Colorado, you know that things will go wrong at each of those steps along the way. Well, if you've only been shown how to put a seed in the ground and then something goes wrong, you're probably not going to understand how to fix the problem. And then you give up and you stop putting seeds in the ground. For those individuals, I say, become a gardener. Learn how to put the seed in the ground, but then learn everything else associated with that seed and the plant. That's what gardeners are. And there are millions of people around the world right now who are just being exposed to planting outside for the first time, because they see a need to grow their own food. And that's how they're approaching it. They're not approaching it as, I want to be a gardener. They're approaching it as, I want to put a seed in the ground and grow a plant and feed my family. Well, I counter with, you might have some success with that as a brand new seed starter, but you'll have more success if you become a gardener. If you approach this as a journey and a philosophy where you can get outside and better yourself in the process. And you can grow plants to harvest and better your family in the process. And hopefully, and this is where it becomes part of my philosophy, hopefully by gardening and taking care of plants and learning, you will become a better person. And you will recognize that by sharing what you've learned in the garden with others, you're making the world a better place. I think a lot of what we do in the garden is so easily transferred to the mentality that we should approach other people that it should be shouted from the rooftops. Gardening is hard. Life is hard. Gardening takes a lot of information for it to become successful. There's a lot of lessons that you have to learn along the way. Well, life gives us those same lessons. But gardening can be very rewarding, especially when we share our successes and we share our stories with others. And that's the way I think the world should be, where we're all helping each other. We're all sharing our stories, and we're all in this for the enjoyment and getting to those successes, but learning from those failures. And I know a lot of you saw my video that I did on April 1st about how to grow spaghetti. And I had a lot of fun making that video. Yes, I had to reshoot a lot of the scenes over and over again. I couldn't get through that shot talking about the space, making me smile now. I couldn't get through that shot where I talked about the spaghetti weevil. I think I shot it 10, maybe 12 times before I could finally keep a straight face. And then I released that last week. And overwhelmingly, the comments were, thank you for lightening up my day and making me smile and making me laugh in this world that we're living in today, because it's hard, it's stressful. But I was actually surprised that I got a couple comments that chastised me, saying, why are you lightening up the mood? Why are you doing this when things are so serious? And my response to that is, because I'm a gardener. Gardeners try to find the good. They try to find the happy point when things are going bad. I've had entire years where I lost an entire garden. Here in Colorado, particularly beginning of June, we get thunderstorms that roll through and drop hail that will blanket the ground inches deep. I've had entire gardens planted with the plants growing and then had a hailstorm demolish the entire thing. Well, that didn't stop me from gardening. I looked at the positive. I realized that some of those plants I had put in maybe could have been done a little bit better. So I replanted the garden. This happened about 10 years ago. So I had a second garden. Now, I couldn't use all of the plants that I had started from seed because they'd already been destroyed. But I had gone to my nursery and gotten plants that I could transplant. A second thunderstorm with hail came through and demolished it. That year, I had to start my garden a third time. Now, did I give up? Did I say, oh, why am I trying? The nature's against me and God's just trying to tell me to stop being a gardener? Not at all. I used it as another opportunity, but this time I learned about hailcloth and I learned about how to protect the young seedlings in the ground. I never got hailstorms like that again, but I learned so much from that experience that I've carried it with me as a positive point, as something that I could do to help prevent that kind of damage ever again. And so I like hoops on raised beds. And a big reason for that is when the thunderstorm is growing and building. And if there's a forecast for hail, I've got the plastic sheets all ready to go, or I've got the hail cloth already strung up. And if the hail hits, I can cover my hoops, protect my plants, and not worry about it at all. And that all came from the adversity that I experienced years ago. So I'm not going to stop trying to paint a rosy picture in the world. I'm going to tell you that gardening is hard, but I'm also going to tell you that there are great rewards with gardening. And if you've got some problem with that, by all means, share that with me, because I do appreciate your opinion. But I'm hoping that you can become the kind of gardener that has a positive outlook, who can start every season with the mentality that it's going to be a great season. And if at the end of the season, everything has been destroyed, well, don't get down. Get up, because you will have learned lessons for next season. And I really think gardeners should have the ability, and do have the ability, if you can call yourself a gardener, to end every season focused on the good, focused on the successes, focused on those happy times when your cat or dog were joining you in the garden, and now looking forward to the next season. And so as you're at home, maybe you've lost your job, maybe you're sick, maybe you really are at a down place in your life. Do look ahead. It's going to get better. The world will recover. If you do any research into the pandemic of 1918 and 1919, you will realize just how devastating that was for the entire world. And we recovered. 100 years later, we're going through some similar events. But please don't be down. Be a gardener. Get outside and put that seed in the ground. Because as I said in my recent video about the Victory Garden, the words of Audrey Hepburn, that to plant a seed is to believe in tomorrow. And that's how I approach gardening, is planting seeds, because I do have hope for gardening. Gardening is all about hope. So keep that hope. If you're feeling down, feel up, because you can know that you're a gardener. And if you're brand new to this and all you're looking for is information on how to start some seeds and how to grow some plants, sure, start that way. But move forward in this gardening journey and become a gardener. That's my philosophy on life. That's my philosophy on gardening. And I hope you can carry it forward. So let's get back to some of the comments. OMFUG, gardeners are natural optimists. Exactly. If you're a gardener, you are an optimist. You have to be. Diane says, hey, if we don't laugh, we'll cry. That's the way I look at it too. Emotions are going to be there. So let's make them happy emotions as much as possible. Lots of good things. Gardening makes us tougher, coming from Heidi. Diane, yes, believe in tomorrow. Tennessee Mountain Morning, don't panic, be a gardener. That should be a t-shirt. Thank you for that. And actually, I agree with you. I think it should be a t-shirt too. So I actually started looking into the process of how to make t-shirts. And so you'll probably see in the weeks ahead that I'll start offering those kind of t-shirts about being a gardener, and also shouting out to the world. Don't be surprised if I'm not wearing a shirt in future videos that says I am a gardener, because I think it should be something you should brag about, especially when other people are just starting to discover it. You can set yourself apart by saying that you are already a gardener. Don't be surprised when we can actually start seeing people again and having more social interactions, that just by acknowledging that you're a gardener, you'll probably be making a lot more friends. Denver 1865, thank you. Be a gardener, plant hope. I like that. In fact, that may be good for a t-shirt as well. A lot of people are going to be exposed to this gardening experience. They're already exposing themselves. The views on my channel are exploding. I look at other gardening channels and their analytics, and they're exploding as well because people are interested. So let's, all of us who have already discovered this, or maybe are in the process of becoming a gardener, let's try to encourage all of those others to become a gardener. When it's all over, don't let them stop. Push your friends and your families that are maybe starting in pots or small beds. Continue to push them. So when we get back to a life, whatever that new normal is, gardening becomes part of our new normal. Kathleen says, a gardener and a screen printer. Awesome. I'm not artistic at all, so I'm actually going to, I figured out some different sources to benefit others. There are artists out there. There are graphic designers that are looking for work. So I fully intend to give artists some work during this process. I'll just be the source of some of these nice gardening t-shirts. But I certainly don't have the artistic ability to be creating them to that degree. Wayne Kerr, everyone thinking they are going to be a gardener is really slowing down your homestead being built. That's interesting that you say that. I think that there will be more people that move into the homestead style of gardening as well. And that may be some of Wayne's concern. The people that have been bugging out and that, maybe are in a location where they've had food, stockpiled because of some of the concerns, most of them that haven't played out. We still have plenty of food in our grocery stores. But looking ahead, I think there's a lot more people that may have been the type that bugged out to a location that realized they hadn't thought enough about gardening. And so I think some urban gardens are going to be developing, some more homesteads are going to be developing. I'll do my role to educate as much as possible, but gardening is going to be part of that new normal. Thank you, Tennessee Mountain. 99 Designs is one of the places I was looking at as a resource for developing some of this stuff. Mia Nanny says, makes you wonder how our family survived the Great Depression, among many other things. Gardens were a big part of those who did survive the Great Depression and made it through. Even when you're out of work, even when things look bleak, if you can find access to a couple seeds, you can grow, and it's definitely better for your mental well-being in addition to what you might be growing. Luz Robles, love the merch idea. My kids already love Gardner Scott and will be super happy to receive a special shirt. That's wonderful. That's just giving me motivation and enthusiasm to do it sooner. So thank you so much. Hopefully this grows to a point where we're finding your world garden travels. I appreciate that as well, because I want to do that. I learn from other people. That's why I like Monty Don and a lot of his videos. All of us should be looking at other people and their gardens, not as a source of jealousy, wishing that you could do it. I have half an acre that I'm constructing a garden on from scratch. You shouldn't be envious of that. You should look at how I do it and learn from it. Just as I go to other gardens and learn from the way that they're doing it. And I've got a really good buddy, Jason, who is a great gardener, and he grows much more than I do. He's the one I've mentioned briefly in the past. We're talking about partnering and working together at a farmer's market this year. And we don't even know if that the farmer's market is going to happen. But what I've done is I've used him for inspiration because he's got some great gardening ideas. And I'm hoping to actually do a video where I can tour Jason's garden to give you ideas of how to garden different from how I garden. So get out there, expose yourself when you can to the botanical gardens that might be in a city near you and watch some of those videos. And a lot of the sources that teach me not necessarily how to garden, but how to set up my garden are from countries all around the world. There are some great videos coming out of Australia There are great videos coming out of England. There are great videos that are coming out of India. There are great gardens all over this world, as Monty Don has shown us. And if you expose yourself to some of those gardens, you'll learn maybe what you like in your garden. And maybe it'll be something that you can try and something that you'll do. So, great discussion all along. I see lots of new people. I'm looking forward to the interplay, getting to some of those questions that I couldn't get to today. And so there's my basic format. I've answered last week's questions. I've answered this week's questions. I've had the discussion with you talking about your gardening week. I've shared some of my philosophy, and I'm planning to follow that basic format as we move forward. So I look forward to your comments. If you're looking at this in replay, definitely put in the comments your thoughts as well, because I see all of those. We're getting to the end of our time. The message for this week is be a gardener and become a better gardener. I'm glad that I can help along the way. I'm hoping that I'm not your only source of information, because there's a lot out there. And I know you can learn from the others that are out there. Learn. Become a better gardener. Continue to support the great way you are, the Gardener Scott channel. And, of course, through it all, enjoy gardening.